Thanks, Ben. Good to be here.
We've had our few chats over the years about mental health and psychology, but for people who don't know your career, could you give a bit of an overview on what you've done over the years and what your mental health care approach is?
Sure. So it's been a minute now that I've been doing this kind of work. I did an undergraduate degree from city in psychology, and I went on to study counseling psychology at McGill and started in the field working for an employee assistance program organization in a clinical role, and then up in through different business relationship management roles into learning development as I went, and corporate performance management, and really all along, practicing the skills and applying them in different kinds of settings, which has led me back to where I am now, working in a primary mental health care setting, and also do some private practice clinical work and some training work as well as part of my own practice.
And your own practice is founded under this idea of your own idea of Portasole. Could you explain what that term means?
Yeah. So when I came up with that term, it was actually it's actually related to the story Under the Tuscan Sun, which is a book that was made into a movie. And I was really quite captivated by that story for many reasons. And the name of the house in that story is Brahmasole. And when I moved to the country a few years ago from the city of Toronto, felt like I sort of wanted to come up with a name for where I'm living here. And I didn't really want to go with Brahmasole because Brahmasole is a combination of the Italian verb bramare, which means to yearn for, and sole, which is the sun. I kind of, the idea of sort of yearning for the sun didn't really resonate with me. I wanted to be a bit more sort of descriptive and active about it. So Portasole is based on the Italian verb portare, which means to bring or to carry the sun. And it just really worked for me about thinking about the place that I live. Little was I to know then that it was going to evolve into also being a description of how I work. The approach that I take to the training work that I do and to the counseling work that I do. So, like I said, it kind of started off as one thing. And as I evolved professionally, I realized that it made sense for me professionally as well.
And what does Portasole, excuse me, mean for psychological care in your practice?
Well, I think it's most fundamentally, it's the difference between waiting for something to happen and making something happen, or looking for another source of light, or figuring out how to be our own source of light.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as we were talking about this, last time we spoke, and just sort of meandering around how this imagery applies to psychology and psychological care and counseling, it kind of landed on the idea of locus of control, which I think it really is very much attached to. And with locus of control being this idea of the extent to which someone sees themselves as sort of in charge, as in charge of what's happening to them, versus somebody who thinks that maybe it's sort of all out of my hands.
And could you contrast those terms? Because for those unfamiliar, there's internal locus of control and there's external locus of control. So what does someone who is internal versus external LOC, how do they behave, think, feel?
Yeah. So locus of control does exist on a continuum, and with the extremes of that continuum being, so someone who operates more from an external locus of control is someone who believes that they really have little or no influence or control over what happens in their lives. So we might hear someone who operates from that perspective saying or thinking things like, it's out of my hands. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing I could have done. My actions don't matter. Or even to the point where they might say that I don't matter. Like I'm just kind of along for the ride. And to contrast that, the internal locus of control, so somebody who operates more from that perspective, it's someone who believes that they have a great deal or even absolute control over what is happening in their lives. So what we might hear from these people could be things like, I've got this, or this is up to me. There's always something that I could do. I'm the master of my own fate, or ideally even, I matter, like I'm in the game and I'm invested in what happens to me.
Mhm.
Now, as is the case with many continuum, like oftentimes someone will exist somewhere in the middle, and it's not it's oftentimes as well, someone will show up a certain way in one situation, maybe a different way in the other, but that's the concept. And it can be a pretty powerful one in a counseling setting when it comes to speaking with a client about how they're showing up and how they're engaged in the world around them.
Yeah, of course, because that would be really valuable for your mental health, being able to take control of of situations that are having a negative impact on your mental well-being, and having that attitude would you'd be able to approach it with such a better mindset.
Yeah, for sure.
And then it also has relevance for the dynamic kind of between the therapist and the client as well. The client feeling like they're in control of their own therapy as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's always going to depend on the therapeutic alliance. The therapeutic alliance in question is going to depend on the therapist, it's going to depend on the client, and also the modality. I definitely work from a short-term solution-focused modality and treat each session like it's the last. Because first of all, it might be, and second of all, in the primary mental health care setting, sometimes I am just having a single session interaction with the client. So the sooner we can sort of get to that point where the client is recognizing that they have influence over what's going on in the room, we're increasing the chance of that mindset being reflected outside of the room as well.
Because it puts the client in the driver's seat in a way where they can choose to end their sessions at any point when they feel they've recovered or they feel they no longer need treatment.
Yeah. And that is something that I think it's important to raise from the outset. I mean, not only talking about goal setting, what is it that we're going to be talking about here, but how will we know when we're done, and positioning termination of counseling as a good thing. Because if it's something that creeps up on the client that the client is not prepared for, and or if the client is operating from this position that it's the counselor who's sort of driving the bus, or the counselor who's the one that's doing all the work and making the difference, the client might feel as though, well, I can't survive without this. Like I need this in order to be able to figure things out. And that is not a good situation to be in, at least not from a short-term solution focus perspective. There certainly are those individuals who can and do benefit from something that's much more in depth and much more long-term. But from the perspective with which I work, the sooner that I can help make it clear to the client that they are in control and that they are in the driver's seat, the better when it comes to just moving forward.
Because there are those situations where someone is going to need like a frequent check-in with their therapist to say, this new thing happened. The same way you go to a doctor and you have your annual or biannual checkup. It's the same thing for mental health. But if the person starts to say, I need to see my therapist to make them so that they can make me feel better, that's where that becomes an issue.
Yeah. And it really is a bit of a difference between seeing therapy or counseling as something that is done to a person, or something that the person is part of a process. And that again, it can be problematic when someone is feeling as though, well, I've got to go to counseling so that therapy can be done to me so that I'll be okay.
Mhm.
Versus, oh, you know what, I really could benefit from having a conversation with my counselor about this, because that's going to help me with hopefully gain a perspective, but I can make a more informed decision going forward. It's a nuanced difference, but it's a very, very important and very powerful one.
And what's the danger or the risk in a client who feels that therapy is being done to them, or they have a dependence on the therapist, something of that sort?
Well, I mean, mostly that is either creating or perpetuating a narrative that the client can't handle things on their own.
Hmm.
This can, like, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can lead to moments when they find themselves in a situation they don't know what to do. They realize that they don't know what to do, and if their instinct is to sort of surrender to that and say, well, I've got to go and find somebody to talk to, I need someone else to guide me, which links back to the concept of locus of control, right? Like the answer must be coming from outside. So if that is the experience in the room with the counselor, then the danger is that will be the client's experience outside of the room as well.
Because if you can carry your own light in that situation and be able to say, this person, my therapist, is part of a process, but the work is coming from me with their assistance, now you can give yourself credibility, and that helps you in and of itself helps your mental health.
Yeah. There's also something interesting that goes on when I mean, it has to do with power differential or perceived power differential. If a client is perceiving me as the expert, then they might be deferring to me for answers to their questions. The reality is that each client is the world leading expert on themselves. So if I'm able to establish that rapport with them, which will allow me to offer a perspective that comes from an informed place, it comes from a place of training and practice and the years of experience. However, he has as many years of experience dealing with the client.
Exactly.
What I'm trying to do is offer the most, the most informed, the soundest perspective in the most appropriate and effective way that hopefully will set the client up to incorporate that perspective into their own processing and then use that perspective to inform their decisions and their actions moving forward.
I love how you phrase that. You are the world leading expert on yourself. That's great. How do you break that kind of dynamic? If a client comes in and it's apparent to you that they have that vision where you are the professional and that external locus of control view on the therapy sessions.
It depends on how it presents. Like if we're having a conversation about that conceptually, then we'll talk about that perception. If I perceive that the client is sort of asking me questions and expecting me to answer, it's maybe not a good practice for me just to get into the question answer kind of pattern. And it can be downright annoying if someone always answers a question with another question. Sort of the classic, therapist sort of move sometimes, which I don't necessarily want to get into that sort of situation either. So what I'll do is I'll look for an opportunity to raise to the client's level of awareness what is happening in the room behaviorally. So a really good example is a client who has a tendency of using, but or yeah, but as a way of sort of shifting focus or deflecting from their own buy-in or responsibility or accountability to something. So if we're talking about something that the client could do or sometimes does, or I'm trying to challenge an assumption or understand a client's motivation, and the client is saying, yeah, but this person always, my father says that, or when I try and do that, yeah, but this is what ends up happening at work. So what I don't want to get into is in an adversarial kind of, well, we'll get over it or whatever, even though that, internally my own self-talk might be, okay, so I wonder, well, what is behind this resistance? That's not what that moment's about. That moment is about bringing to the client's attention that their tendency so far in this conversation has been to deflect from sort of investing in this moment rather than, instead of what they're doing, which is sort of looking for a way to deflect away from it. It's because of all these other things that are going on. And once a client starts to recognize those kinds of behaviors as things that are showing up in the counseling session, which is a very strong indicator that they're showing up elsewhere as well, then we can start talking about, all right, so what to do with that? Is the client okay with that? Is this something the client wants to have a look at and practice doing something differently? Because that's exactly what counseling is all about, is creating that safe space that is hopefully free of, the client perceives that it's free of judgment. I'm not here to judge. It's a place where the client can practice and experiment with some new perspectives and behaviors and try things on for size.
Experiment with different perspectives. So you're catching them on their old perspectives and old ways of maybe articulating something or behaviors and feelings, and you're creating this self-awareness for them so that they can then, what's the goal there? So that they develop the self-awareness so that they can kind of catch themselves.
Yeah. So they can make an informed decision about whether or not that continues to work for them. If someone who is operating from a largely external locus of control, for example, and they're feeling like, oh, it doesn't matter what I do, why does this always happen to me, that sort of thing, I could try and get to the point, once they realize that they're doing it, or that they have a tendency of doing that, I can ask the very potentially challenging and confrontational question, how's that working for you? And hopefully not in a way that comes across glib, because I'm not trying to do shade or shame at all. If the client is saying, I'm actually fine with it. Like, I don't want to have any more influence over this kind of situation than I already do, then okay, great. Moving on. If the client says, I don't know if the client has ever answered the question. When I've asked that question, I don't know if a client has ever said, "Oh, it's working great." Because I mean, if it was working great, then they wouldn't be in the room with me. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And then that's how you, and then that's a strategy for breaking out of external locus of control as well, as being able to develop that self-awareness and catch yourself saying, oh, this was out of my control. This wasn't something I could have influenced, etc.
Or realizing that, you know what, that actually might have been something that I could have influenced. So if the client had surrendered to the idea that they had no power in that situation, unknowingly, if they had already surrendered to that, then what I might be able to do is perhaps suggest the notion that they do have power to influence in those sorts of moments, which is moving the needle from more external a little bit closer along to the internal focus of control continuum.
Mm-hmm. And then once you have that internal locus of control and you can influence your own actions, it sounds like a lot of being able to try different things in such different situations, because you have the client's going to have some goal in mental health, whether it be to be nicer to themselves, develop a different perspective on a particular area of life, and they can change how they approach it with their actions, and being able to acknowledge situations where they have to have control over it. How do you deal with a client who comes in and is resisting the idea that, oh, here was a situation where I actually did have control over it, but I refused and I went the external locus of control route?
Very carefully.
Okay.
There are a lot of reasons why someone might be resistant to the idea that they have the ability to determine their own outcomes. They may have tried to do so in the past and it has not gone well. There's a lot that likely has transpired in the past, and I'm talking about trauma, being aware of the impact of trauma, just the experience of having someone in a perceived position of power or influence kind of suggests that they could or should have done something differently. Like, it's something that needs to be approached with great sensitivity. So what I might do is speak about imagery, speak about metaphor, use an example of where um, being aware of one's own ability to influence a situation is important, so that we're not talking about the client's choice or action in that case. We're talking about what sometimes can happen using a much more neutral example. And then once we establish rapport over that, then maybe we can get a little closer to how that might be leveraged or how that might show up in the client's case.
Because it's important to note as well that the client isn't trying to affect the outcome of it. They're just in that situation. They're trying different actions to maybe influence the outcome, but it needs to be known that they can't control the outcome of the situation that they're having trouble with.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's getting into the idea of outcomes versus actions. A client can quickly become paralyzed if they think they know what they want an outcome to be, but they have no idea how to get there. One example that I'll sometimes use is the example of anyone who has ever traveled. It's quite often where you can't get a direct flight from one place to the next place. You have to plan your route, and unless you live within walking distance of an airport, you're probably going to have to figure out how to get to the airport as well. So there's a lot of steps that are involved to get from where one is to where one thinks that one wants to go. And sometimes what a client is doing unknowingly is trying to figure out the path of least resistance from where they are, which is not where they want to be, to where they think they want to go, without being present to this idea that, okay, maybe there are a whole lot of steps though in between. So if I can help to break down that notion that, like, I have to go from here to this exact place in one step, otherwise not only am I a failure, but there's no sense even trying, then things can become more manageable. That next step can become more manageable if the client is focusing on just an action rather than the outcome. It's another one of the cliches or metaphors, that this idea of the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. It's one thing to be familiar with those words. It's another thing to know how that shows up in someone's life or in one's own life in the case of the client.
In that example you gave of trying to get from one city to another, instead of saying I need to get from Toronto to Paris, you might say, okay, well, I need to get a car to the airport, and the airport to this airport back over to France, and then you can arrive, and then you can get the car, etc. So it's a lot. And then now you're focusing on what you can control, which are the steps along the way, instead of this potentially paralyzing outcome of, oh my God, I have to get halfway across the world.
Yeah. And the decision of someone makes in the moment, like, so I can decide to get on the subway that is going to the airport. That is something that I can do. I can't just snap my fingers and get to that place that feels unreachable right now, because maybe it is unreachable right now, and maybe that's okay. So let's shift away from trying to achieve something that's not achievable and shift more towards something that is achievable, and then practice what that feels like.
Yeah. And then that relates back to locus of control as well, because someone who has an external locus of control view might just look at the outcome and think it's impossible to get there, and then look outwards on the situation thinking it's impossible. Whereas internal locus of control, you look at the steps that along the way that you can control.
Exactly. And similarly, it's the difference between hiring a car service to come and pick the person up and take them exactly where they want to go versus taking public transit. Internal locus of control is kind of more like public transit, because I got to figure out, so how does this work? How am I going to get there? What do I have to do? Where does the bus go? Where's the bus going to let me off? Rather than just kind of sitting back and letting the travel happen to me, which is what happens when you just give it to somebody else to take care of.
Yeah. Another analogy that you mentioned in our pre-discussion that I thought did a great job of illustrating the importance of internal locus of control was your oxygen mask example. Could you go into that a bit?
Yeah, this one comes up a lot, and I think it's in part because the setting that I work in, it's very much front on. It tends to be very situational. So people are finding themselves in situations that they're really not sure what to do about, much less how to even think about it. When I perceive that someone isn't actively practicing self-care, I'll ask them if they've ever been on an airplane before, if they've ever traveled anywhere by commercial airplanes. And if they have, then perhaps they will have experienced a moment when right after the cabin door closes, the announcements start. And at one point in the announcements, there will inevitably be a moment where it'll go something like this. The announcement will say, in the unlikely event of a loss of cabin pressure, an oxygen mask will fall from the overhead compartment. And then I'll often ask the client, what is the very next thing that is said in that announcement? More oftentimes than not, the client will say, please be sure to put on your own mask before helping somebody else with theirs. And then I'll say, great. All kidding aside, and well, you gotta put on your own mask. Why? Why is that actually part of the announcement? There's a very practical reason, because if a person is not breathing on an airplane where there is a loss of cabin pressure, that person is at risk of injury or death. And the quickest way to make sure that each person is breathing in that sort of a moment is to ask them to first and foremost take care of putting their mask on their own face. So, and only then, first of all, are they able to breathe, which they kind of need to do. And only then are they able to help someone if somebody else needs help. So once we sort of talk about that moment, and I'll ask the question, is that a reasonable thing to ask people to do, to make sure to put on their own mask first before assisting somebody else with theirs? And nobody has ever said that it's not reasonable. Okay, great. So let's imagine, because I try and use us, we pronouns as much as I can in counseling as well, because it breaks down the sense of power differential or expert, expert, or whatever that dynamic is working out to be. I might say, imagine a situation where you're sitting on that same plane together side by side. So turbulence, the masks fall down, you're having a bit of a hard time putting yours on. And so you look over and you see me putting on my mask. Are you thinking to yourself, that selfish blankety blank? Are you thinking to yourself that? And the client will inevitably say, no. You're doing what you got to do, which will allow me to get to the idea of selfishness. Selfishness, the word selfishness tends to carry with it a very negative connotation. And sometimes I'll position myself as a bit of, champion for selfishness, which sort of makes it okay for us to think about taking care of ourselves first. And what I'll look for the earliest opportunity to do is either combat the negative connotation attached to the word selfishness, or a bit replace it with the term self-care. I must prioritize my own self-care, otherwise I'm not living, thriving, or able to help anybody else. And in that sense, self-care equals self-respect. So that example, the experiential example, the imagery of putting on my own mask to make sure that I'm breathing is something that almost, if not all, clients are able to relate to, and it allows them to start practicing giving themselves permission to make sure that their mask is on.
And that's a big part of the value of using metaphor in mental health conversations as well, because in psychology, you're dealing with a lot of abstract concepts and that kind of thing. But when you're presented in a metaphor in a real life situation, there's a very universally agreed, here's how you act. And then it's difficult. It's more difficult to refute that, or it illustrates the point a lot better.
Like I really try to avoid those moments where I ask clients to take my word for something, because even though I might be more of an expert on certain things, certain things than they are, I don't want to get into a discussion of semantics. So like in that example, if someone is not breathing, nothing else matters. Like all bets are off. And if the situation that has brought the client into the counseling room is allowed to perpetuate without any kind of attempt for change, it's possible that situation could become unmanageable. And mental health is health. All of these things can lead to poor outcomes. Therefore, it's very important for us to prioritize above all self-care.
Of course. And that situation as well, it also exemplifies why not taking care of yourself is particularly dangerous, because in that situation, someone comes in and they're very committed to that external locus of control, carry other people's light before yourself. You can illustrate in that situation, well, if you do that, you are not breathing.
Exactly. The light bulb that sort of goes on, that kind of moment, especially when we're using this kind of imagery and that example of the oxygen mask, is oftentimes people aren't aware that they are operating with as much of an external locus of control as they are. They're not aware that, oh yeah, I'm prioritizing others' lives over mine. Like I know that my hand is the oxygen mask that I need to live, and I'm willingly giving it to everyone but myself. They really aren't aware that their actions are resulting in that sort of circumstance. And once they become more aware of it and they realize, oh, okay, wait a minute, I actually do really need to prioritize my own self-care, then that allows them to make decisions that are differently informed if they choose to. It's still never going to be something that, like, I'm never going to tell a client what to do, and I'm very, very clear about that. All I'm doing is offering a perspective that hopefully is meaningful, is memorable, in a way that it'll show up in those moments when clients need to make decisions about what they're going to do in these contextual situations that are challenging to them.
And then once you've established that self-awareness and that understanding that from the client's perspective, that they are kind of providing their own light to others instead of carrying their own, etc., what are some strategies to be able to develop that mindset? Just practical ones that they can do outside of the office.
Well, first and foremost, practice being aware on a moment to moment basis when the mask is on versus when it is not on. Awareness is at least 90% of the battle. So in a moment where a client is feeling, whether it's anxious, whether they're feeling powerless, whether there's some situation, depression, or whatever is going on, if in that moment they're able to recenter and ask themselves if they are attending to their own self-care, that's sort of starts from there. Because if more oftentimes than not, they won't be practicing self-care in that moment. So then it becomes a matter of, all right, so what to do? Again, don't worry about the outcome in that moment, because the outcome might be something that is either not clear or you're not sure how to get from where you are at that time to where you want to be. Put into motion one of your actions that you know has a good potential to help you move forward. So like we'll talk about a tool. We'll talk about a toolkit. What are the things in moments of difficulty that you can do that will help you feel more safe and more grounded, and a little bit to help reflect your focus away from this thing that's causing you that distress in a moment, to help you move forward again. Another image, another metaphor that comes in very handy in having those kinds of conversations is sharks. There are some species of shark, including the great white as an example, who must be swimming forward at a certain velocity in order to move enough water over their gills so that they're able to breathe. I think it's referred to as ram ventil it's ram ventilation or something like that. That might not be the exact term. I think humans are in some ways like this. We must be moving forward, particularly in moments where we're experiencing some kind of maybe situational paralysis, in order for us to find our way out of that. So if I can create that awareness in the moment, if a person is feeling and they remember, you know what, I either need to pay attention to whether or not my mask is on or whether or not I'm moving forward. Okay, my mask maybe isn't on, I'm not moving forward. Great. Okay, so I'm going to maybe pull my focus a little bit away from whatever it is that is causing me this situational distress, back to something that I can do, internal locus of control, to help me move through this and get past it.
And that's very individualistic as well, of knowing yourself and knowing what actions work for you in this moment versus that moment.
Yeah. I can make suggestions, but again, linking back to that idea of each client being the world leading expert on them, I don't know what works best for them in those moments of distress. So we'll talk about that. And the toolkit that the client builds is much more likely to be effective if they're the ones putting tools into that kit, because they know how to do it. They know it's going to work. They're going to remember that, rather than trying to think back to, oh yeah, what is it that the counselor said in that session, which is another example of how the client in the counseling session feeling like the counselor is in the driver's seat can be harmful beyond if the client is thinking about what the counselor said versus what it is that they know how to do in those moments when they need to figure something else out.
And then I want to be cognizant of our time here. So we've established what Portasole means and its relevance to internal locus of control, what the importance of having that is, what the danger of not having it is, some strategies to developing it, self-awareness. But if you had to give one important advice to someone who has heard all that and wants to start carrying their own light, what would it be?
Just pay attention to whether or not you practicing self-care versus when you aren't. Attention to whether or not you are emitting your own light, or whether you're reflecting the light of what's going on around you. It can't overestimate the importance of awareness. Awareness leads to improved self-care, and self-care leads to much improved outcomes. And the converse is true. When people are not aware that we aren't practicing self-care, there is a greatly increased potential for a poor outcome.
That did catch my ear, that statement that self-awareness is 90% of the battle. So once you learn to catch yourself and develop that skill, you're most of the way there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, I think that sums up our topic pretty well. I think we got some good points in there.
I've enjoyed the conversation. I mean, this is something that is it's very important in the work that I do, and certainly in this kind of modality and this
Mhm.
context of mental health. So it's a pleasure to have a chat with you about it.